I'm Kevin Lang. On behalf of the economics department, I want to welcome you all to this event. Thank you all for coming. It is a fully packed house, a great honor to Bob Rosenthal. I want to start by, first of all, thanking Liz Rosenthal and also Bob's mother, Ruth Rosenthal, and his sister, Janet Stradley, for their support for this event, and also to a number of other people who have supported this event. I also want to thank the Graduate Economics Association, and in particular Brad and Arup for their work organizing this, and my thanks to my longtime friend Jean Tirole for agreeing to be our speaker. I've been ordered by Norma not to speak for very long, and although some of you might think that as chair that I don't have to obey orders, she is one of the people whose orders I do have to obey. But I do just want to take a second to remember Bob. I first met Bob in 1987 when Andy Weiss, Bob, and I were being recruited to the Boston University Economics Department. And Bob had decided to sign on, and he called me up, and it was a very warm and very pleasant conversation. And I came away with two good feelings. One was that I thought I would like him very much, and the second was that I thought it was great that BU was being successful in hiring such a distinguished game theorist. But I also knew that since he was a game theorist, he and I would have no intellectual companionship. And it wasn't, from that perspective, the fact that he'd been hired wasn't very important to me. Well, Bob turned out to be perhaps the person who has influenced me most intellectually in my life, certainly up there with a couple of undergraduate teachers. So that shows you how wrong I was. And I think it speaks to a number of very important aspects of Bob's personality. The first was that he was a teacher. Okay? And I think one of the reasons that the Rosenthal family wanted this event to include so much interaction between graduate students and the speaker, and again, we thank you, Jean, for all you've done meeting with our graduate students, was that that was very important to Bob. I think it also speaks to, obviously, his tremendous intellect, that he had the capacity to influence people in that way. And it speaks to both his ability to be frank, and all of us who knew him knew that he was very frank, but he did it in a way that was not offensive. When I first developed an intellectual relationship with him, I came in to show him a paper that had been accepted at a leading journal and asked him if he thought there were any technical problems that he should correct, that I should correct, I should say. And he responded in no uncertain terms that it was a total outrage that this paper had been accepted by any journal whatsoever. But not only that, he set me an exercise to solve, which turned out to be our first paper together. And in the course of writing that paper, I actually convinced him that although the paper didn't meet his standards of rigor, that I actually did have a point. And we went on to write a couple of papers together. And I certainly continue very much to miss both that friendship and that intellectual companionship. I'm not going to be the one introducing Jean. That'll be Albert Ma doing that. But I do want to say one thing. When I do talk about my teachers, I have to add Jean to the group. Jean and I were supposedly students together at MIT. I made the mistake my first semester of taking Eric Maskin's public finance theory course, not realizing that I had neither the mathematical nor the economics background to take it. Fortunately, half of the grade was a take-home problem set, and we were told that while we should work it out ourselves, it was perfectly all right to ask other members of the class for help. I did get 8 hints from Jean. It was a 7-line proof, and I did get full credit for the problem set. So I'm very pleased to once again have the opportunity to learn from Jean, another of my teachers. And with that, once again, I thank you all and turn it over to Albert Ma, who will introduce Jean.
It is my honor to introduce to you the Rosenthal Memorial Lecturer, Jean Tirole. When I was asked to introduce John, I thought this was going to be very easy. I could do it in about 3 seconds. I can just stand up and say, John needs no introduction. But then Norma said, this is going to be a real introduction. So don't be lazy. Do your work and then do a serious introduction. So being an academic, I would have to do some research, some analysis, and I have to write up something. So I did all of them. So I started, like everybody else these days, with Google.com. So I sat in front of the computer, I type in Jean Tirole, and hit return. In about 0.25 of a second, about 200,000 hits came out. And well, a little bit later, my Chinese students told me, oh, if you have tried Google, the Chinese version, you would have even gotten more. So overall, it's so hard to do the research because there's a lot of stuff about Jean Tirole. So who is Jean Tirole? Well, he is a scientific director of a research institute, IDEA, in Toulouse. He is a researcher of some institutes in Paris, and allow me not to embarrass myself by omitting these names. These French names, they sound too Chinese for me to pronounce. He's also a visiting professor at MIT. He has been awarded many fellowships, and I have to read from a list, and has been honored by the most prestigious academic organizations, such as the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Econometric Society, American Economic Review. He was the president of the Econometric Society, as well as the European Economic Association. He gave many addresses, and these addresses were named after giants in economics like Rosenthal, Marshall, Hicks, Vorax, and Tinbergen. Now, what about Jean Tirole's economics? Well, his CV here is really long. If you have a slow internet connection, do not try to download. If you have a slow printer, don't print it. If you are in a hurry, don't try to read it. You cannot finish it in a very short amount of time. So in the past 25 years, Jean has published about 150 papers in English, all of them in top journals, and numerous others in French. He has written about 10 books, many of them, such as those on industrial organization, game theory, regulations, telecommunications, are classics. His books have been translated into many languages: Chinese, that explains it, Russian, Italian, German, Spanish, and Japanese. Of course, one really shouldn't judge scientific contribution by the number of pages. Though indeed, Jean Tirole's contribution is very much far and beyond the number of pages he has published. Why? His ideas have influenced many papers that others have published. In fact, if one studies the titles of his papers, just read his CV, one already discovers what microeconomics is all about in the past 20 years. His research has started or shaped the development of a long list of fields: incentive and contract theory, organization and collusion, government, bureaucracy, industrial organization, antitrust policies, regulation and public policies, finance and banking, and game theory. Jean opens up entire fields of studies, and he is simply a pioneer in microeconomics. So Jean's research is often motivated by real problems, and in the past few years, he has been contributing to the economic problems in software design, internet connection between information systems, network platform competition. He is also an explorer. So currently, he is leading our way to work on problems that have been mostly studied by sociologists and psychologists. So very soon, we are going to put them out of business. So in summary, I think John is the unique economist who has contributed in so many fields in economics. His portfolio of ideas has widened the scope of our discipline. Furthermore, he has developed new techniques and new insight to make these studies interesting and possible. Now, to round up this introduction, I guess I'm supposed to tell you some stories about John that cannot be read off the internet so easily. And I have done some real research. It's hard work this time. And I can tell you 3 stories. Except for one, however, I can't really vouch for the veracity. So I've heard about these stories, but there's one that I can be quite certain of. And I think they're going to tell you about Jean Tirole as a person. First, his PhD thesis at MIT. So I was told by some of his classmates that it was the shortest ever, about 46 pages long. And he almost wasn't allowed to graduate. Why? Because he almost failed the regulation for minimum residence requirement. He did it in about 2 years and 3 months. So John, I think you are a little bit rebellious. And second, there is a rumor that when he left MIT for Toulouse back in the early 1990s, one reason was that he complained that folks at MIT were working really too hard. And it's too hard for his taste, so we can conclude that John is really 100% French. And finally, this is my own personal story, and this is really true. And it must have been about 1 or 2 summers ago. And it was a Sunday afternoon, and I was in Chinatown, of course, Boston, Chinatown. I was just buying some takeout from a restaurant. So I went into this restaurant called Asian Gardens on Harrison Avenue to pick up my food. And there they were, the entire Tirole family sitting there. And so I went over to say hi, and hi, what are you doing here? And John said, we are trying to get some dim sum. The problem was Asian Gardens offered no dim sum. Only entrees, rice plates and noodle plates. It was a good non-dim sum place, otherwise I wouldn't be buying there. So I realized that they really went to the wrong restaurant, and they seemed to be a little bit lost with the menu. So I did the most Samaritan thing and helped them pick up a few items from the menu. I didn't stay long enough to see how the lunch eventually turned out to be. So now we know that John himself actually suffered from problems of asymmetric information and uncertainty about product quality. So I think, just to finish, I think that Bob Rosenthal would have listened to Jean Tirole's economic ideas any day. And ladies and gentlemen, may I present our lecturer, Jean Tirole.
Well, thank you, Kevin and Albert, for those very warm and too kind introductions. I would like to thank also Arup and Brad and all the other students for inviting me. It's a really great honor to be giving this Robert Rosenthal lecture. When Drew Fudenberg and I were taking the game theory course, and Kevin as well, maybe you have a better memory than I do, we were learning game theory from Eric Maskin at MIT when we were graduate students, and Bob was already a major figure in game theory at the time. For example, he had just completed his work on the centipede game, and he had unveiled a number of intricacies of backward induction and proposed some solutions to that, something very close to the modern quantal response, quantal choice theory. He had introduced random matching to the profession and the concept of reputation with changing partners. He had done many things already at the time, and of course he went on to pursue a very distinguished career with some kind of work on experimentation and auctions, I/O, and much more. Now, it's also a very wonderful opportunity to remember Bob. I didn't know him well enough to be in the inner circle of his friends, but I knew Bob quite well, especially from my full-time days in Boston. For example, we co-organized the workshops, the theory workshops together, and we had lots of opportunities to work together. And I remember Bob as someone who was always very warm, cheerful, and friendly, and a very modest person. I think a major benefit of this profession is that we meet from time to time, actually more than from time to time, very true scholars, people who are intellectually curious and focused on advancing science, and Bob, I think, was undoubtedly one of them. Okay, without further ado, I have to give a speech. Actually, Norma told me that I had to give a speech, so, so I'm going to give a speech. I found that on my computer after talking to Norma this morning. So I'm going to talk about some research I'm doing with Roland Benabou, and Roland deserves a lot of credit for the good things, at least, which are in there. The bad things, I take responsibility. And it's going to be about economic incentives and motivation. And it starts with a kind of puzzle about things, weird things we all do, like voting, which we all know that voting is I should stay close to the microphone, I guess. Voting is a very crazy thing because we are never going to affect the outcome of an election, and it's really a zero benefit activity, individual pride benefit activity. We volunteer, we give to charitable organizations, we help strangers we are never going to see again. And in some extreme cases, people are going to join rescue squad, they're going to risk their life and so on. So we engage in prosocial behavior without any apparent benefit to ourselves. Now you might say, it's simple, we can explain that through prosocial tastes, through other regarding preferences, and we just add the fact that we like to benefit other people into our utility function, and that's the end of the story. However, it's not the end of the story because some phenomena cannot be explained by the sole presence of those other regarding preferences. So for example, it's very hard to explain any kind of crowding out effect. A crowding out effect exists when the supply decreases with the price. So for example, if you are paid to give blood, then you give less blood or less often. That's a crowding out effect, and that's something that has been emphasized quite a lot by a number of both psychologists and economists. And I don't want to emphasize crowding out effects. I mean, I think they are kind of the extreme case in which you have a downward sloping supply curve, which basically contradicts all of we know about price theory. But more generally, there is this idea that the price is not very effective as an incentive device. Another thing which is not very well explained by standard altruism that you might add to your model is the fact that actually a lot of the good deeds we do is actually to buy social prestige. If you look at the data on donations, for example, 90 or 95% of the donations are not anonymous; they are very conspicuous. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of evidence that when we are watched, we engage in more prosocial behavior. So I'm more likely to help the little old lady cross the street if you are watching me than if you are not watching me. There are lots of things about codes of honors and shame. So that really plays a role, and that has nothing to do with altruism. It has something to do with signaling and buying social prestige, trying to show that one is someone generous or good and so on. Similarly, there's a lot of evidence that we are trying to buy self-esteem for oneself. We want to think of ourselves as being good people. We want to have a good image of ourselves. And we are engaging in self-signaling. And of course, that's something that Adam Smith discussed a long time ago. He talked about this impartial spectator, who is inside us, and basically evaluates as an equitable judge our own behavior. So basically, we look at ourselves and define ourselves through our past actions. And that, of course, is going to give an incentive to engage in prosocial behavior so as to think of ourselves as being good people. We want to look at ourselves in the mirror. Similarly, if you look at the Red Cross site that I gave here, helping others feels good and makes you feel good about yourself. The Red Cross and other charitable organizations are really building on this idea that you want to feel good about yourself. So if you give, you're going to feel better about yourself. So you can have social signaling and you can have self-signaling. And again, you can have crowding out effects which cannot be explained by other regarding preferences, because if you have other regarding preferences and you add a price and incentive to do things, then it's just going to increase the supply. It's never going to reduce it. Now, just as an aside, I want to re-emphasize the fact that generosity is a very, very complex concept. You have some interesting experiments, lots of them, and here's one particular interesting one is by Dana, Weber, and Kwang on exploiting moral wiggle room. What they do is to play what's called dictator games. So basically, you have one person choosing an allocation for himself and another person in a dictator fashion. So for example, you have a set of two allocations, A and B. A gives 6 to the dictator and 1 to the other person, whereas B gives 5 to each. So B is more equitable, fairer in some sense. Now, if I ask you to choose between A and B, of course, just from point of view of yourself, A is better because it gives you 6 instead of 5. However, probably at least 3/4 of you are going to choose B. And the numbers are chosen, of course, to induce at least a little bit of generous behavior. You're going to say, at least 3/4 of you are going to say, well, I'm losing 1, it's bad, but, it's cheap. I'm going to be generous and I'm going to give something to the other person. Okay, so that's fine. You can just say there is some altruism, possibly. However, it's much more complicated than that. And I'm going to show you it's not altruism. So what those people do is to modify slightly the experiment. So there are 2 states of nature. The first state of nature is just like before. So the choice A gives 6 to the dictator and 1 to the other. Choice B gives 5 to each. Whereas in the other state of nature, things are simple. A is better for both. So A is going to give 6 to the dictator and 5 to the other, whereas B gives 5 and 1. So in the second state of nature, the one which is on the right-hand side, it's pretty clear what you should be doing. You should be choosing A because it's better for both. In the first state of nature, well, you have to trade off between your own interest and being generous. Okay? Now, at the start, the subjects don't know the state of nature, but if they want, they can click on a button. Okay? And if they click on this button, they will learn the state of nature before making their choice. Okay? And lo and behold, guess what happens? Well, what happens is that half of the people, including lots of those people who chose B in the first place, decide not to know. And what do they choose? A, right? They choose A. Okay? We know from decision theory that it's not a game. You're just by yourself here. Apparently, it's not a game. It's better to have more information. If you are in the second state of nature, you'll choose A. That's fine. In the first state of nature, you can choose A and B depending on your preferences if you are generous or not. So it's better to have the information. Half of the people choose not to have the information. And then they go and choose a selfish choice. They choose A. Because they have the excuse, the self-excuse, that actually they may not have hurt the other person. It may be the case, actually, that was better for both. Okay? Now, this is a pure example of self-signaling. There is no social signaling going on here. Because what happens is that an experiment in front of the computer, it's completely anonymous, and you choose whatever you want. So you're just trying to convince yourself, already in the first case, that you are generous. However, if you can find an excuse and create a cloud of smoke so that you are not completely convinced and you won't remember exactly how selfish you are, then you are going to become selfish again. Okay? Now, in a sense, if you have some kind of excuse, of course it's a fake excuse. It's a bad excuse, but, you're going to do that. So that's the example where you walk on the sidewalk and, and there's a beggar and you change side so as not to be in front of the beggar and having to give. Or you can place yourself on a donor registry. There's no commitment. You can always say no if you're asked to give your kidney or whatever later on. However, you are worried that once you are being asked, you'll be giving your kidney, and therefore you don't put yourself on the donor registry, and there are many other examples like that. There are various variants done by Dana, Weber, and Kwong. So for example, this is the case where you have two proposers. If both ask for A, then they get their selfish choice. They both get 6, and the third party who is not proposing gets 1. But if anyone chooses B, then you get 5, 5, 5. The third party gets 5. So anyone in this game can enforce a fair outcome if he wants to. However, lots of people now choose A when they were not choosing A in the other thing, because they have this fake excuse that actually they're sharing responsibility. That's not really they're doing, that there was a selfish choice in the end. Okay? So, and there are lots of other experiments like this that I want to mention, and that you have to keep in the back of your mind to understand that generosity is actually a very complex concept, and also that there is a lot of self-signaling going on. Okay? I want to think of myself as someone decent, even so I may not be decent, and I may act in this, with this view. So Roland Benabou and I develop a model of prosocial behavior which is going to combine heterogeneity in individuals' degree of altruism and greed. We want to think of ourselves as being different, and therefore it's going to give rise to some signaling concern. There will be some concern for social reputation and or self-respect. So social signaling or self-signaling, fortunately, the modeling is exactly the same. It's a little bit simpler to think about social signaling than self-signaling, but we could discuss self-signaling if you're interested in that. We will have 3 motives for prosocial behavior, which correspond to our discussion. Intrinsic, you may be truly generous. Extrinsic, meaning that you are going to get some money possibly for doing this prosocial behavior, or some sanction if you don't do it. And then you have the reputational incentive, which is going to be the key of what we are going to discuss. As you have seen in the discussion, you need to have reputation, otherwise you cannot understand altruism. Those 3 interact, and we want to understand how the balance changes with the power of incentives, the disclosure of rewards, or the prominence of actions. It's going to be an information-based approach to crowding out. Crowding out is only a piece of the paper. I don't want to emphasize that too much, but it's very important to understand why we are going to get crowding out. The idea is that rewards or punishment are going to spoil the reputational value of good deeds by creating doubt, self-doubt, perhaps, as to the underlying motivation. So basically, if I being paid to give blood, and I give the blood, then you wonder whether I did it because I was generous and prosocial, or just because I wanted the money. So it's going to create some noise in your inference about me, and that's going to reduce my incentive to do it. Actually, there's this very nice quote by Fran Yegan: an intrinsically motivated person is deprived of the chance of displaying his or her own interest and involvement in an activity when someone else offers a reward or orders him or her to do it. Now, this is very much what psychologists say. That has a well-known name. In psychology, it's called the overt justification effect. And perhaps our contribution is basically to recast this overt justification effect as a signal extraction problem. Closely related work, well, there is some other work on crowding out effects, which are based on informed principle approach. Basically, the idea there is that the person who builds a contract, including an incentive scheme, has private information about the talent or the task, the talent of the agent or the task or whatnot, and through the incentive that this principle is providing, it's going to change the information structure of the agent and therefore the incentive of the agent. So, for example, if you pay a child or or a pupil to do something, or if you give some specific incentive, then the child or the pupil is going to think, this person doesn't trust me, and therefore the intrinsic motivation might be decreasing, and there are a bunch of papers along those lines. And there are lots of papers, by the way, on crowding out effects that I will put in this category for various reasons. For example, there is this famous experiment by Nisi and Rusticini on daycare centers in Israel. As many of you may know the experiment, but basically it goes as follows. They went to the daycare center. When you arrive late in those daycare centers, you were not paying a fine. Okay? So they measure how many parents come late to pick up their child, and then at some point they introduce a fine. And then they measure the number of parents arriving late to pick up their child. And you will expect from price theory that it should go down. Actually, it goes up. And then they take out the fine, they remove the fine, and then instead at the eye level. So it doesn't go back to the previous level. And one interpretation that is given actually by, say, Gnisi is that actually the fine was about $3, Well, arriving late was only $3 bad. After all, that puts a price. And all the, you basically learn it's not that costly, and therefore, why not arrive late if you're in a rush to do other things. There are a bunch of other papers on social orientation signaling. The closest are a nice paper and very unknown paper by Giacomo Corneo. And my colleague in Toulouse, Paul Sebright, has also a nice paper on that, which are a bit connected to what I'm going to talk about today. So today I'm going to describe the model, go through the heuristics just to give you the intuition of what's going on, discuss how you can get crowding out. So I'll basically recast the overjustification effect as a signal extraction one, talk about social norms, talk about disclosure and the confidentiality of rewards and action, and then discuss, if I have time, policy setting of public and private sponsors, where the policy setting will have two dimensions. One will be the reward that you give for participating. The other one is the publicity you give, how much disclosure you do of the actions. Okay. So let me stop with this introduction. I should have said right away that if you want to interrupt me, I will welcome the interruptions. So don't hesitate to do it if you want. So let me first describe the model that I'm going to use in order to formalize those ideas. So basically, the agents will choose some kind of participation level A in some prosocial activity. It can be discrete, 0, 1. I give blood, or I don't give blood, I vote, or I don't vote, or it can be a continuous variable, whatever, and we'll be using both. So think about A as a provision of a public good or some kind of help or contribution to a charity, reciprocating a friendly action, refraining from imposing a negative externality, and so on and so forth. Now this action will have a cost C of A and be rewarded in a linear fashion, to simplify. So the reward will be Y times A. And there are various applications. So think about the reward as being positive, so it doesn't really matter. And sometimes you give money, but here you're going to get a positive reward. Okay, so C of A is a cost, and the reward is proportional to A. So we are going to take Y as given for the moment. Later on, it's going to be a policy choice. The individual is going to get direct benefits from pro or anti-social activity. So let me go through that. First, there's some kind of direct benefit from the enjoyment that you get from giving. So it can be your own valuation for the public good that you are creating, or it can be some kind of joy of giving, and we'll call that VA. VA is the valuation for the cause, and that gives you a utility VA times A. So VA is how, for example, how generous you are fundamentally. Okay? And let's assume that the utility you derive from it is proportional to the quantity that you supply. Second, you are going to care about money. So Vy is your marginal valuation for money. When you give A, you are going to receive Ya. So think of Y, for example, as how much money you get for giving blood. Vy times Ya is your valuation for the money you receive. Okay, so that's the extrinsic incentive. And then you may have some, that's not going to play a big role, you may have some cost C of A. So for example, when you give your blood, you have to spend some time going there, you don't like the needle, and so on. So there's some cost that you incur in doing so if you want. Now for the moment, an individual preference type or identity will just be how much you value the cause, Va, and how much you value money, how greedy you are, which is Vy. And it's drawn from some distribution. So that's who you are, really. Okay. Later on, I will be considering a broader type, but I cannot describe it yet. Okay. So the other part, so that, I'm sorry, this gives you the intrinsic incentive and the extrinsic incentive. Now there is a third part, which is reputation. When you contribute to public good, you buy social prestige and you buy self-prestige. So basically, we're going to take that as a reduced form. And this is an assumption. There's no reason why you should take this reduced form too seriously. It depends on what kind of continuation game you have. But it's going to simplify things a little bit if we take this particular form. So let's assume that you care about, let's think about social signaling, that's simpler. So I care about your estimate of Va. I want you to think I'm generous. Okay? So looking at my action A and looking at the incentive I face, which was Y, you're going to infer something about me. You're going to infer something about my Va. And let's assume I care about the expectation, the posterior expectation about Va, about what you believe who I am. So basically, implicitly, there is some kind of continuation game where my utility grows if you have a more favorable opinion of me. Okay? It might be a matching game. There are papers who have done matching games. I mean, there are various stories behind that. Or it can just be self-image. I just care about your, even if we are not going to interact, I just care about your thinking I'm a generous person. Whatever you want. Gamma is how much I care. I'm going to assume, and that's perhaps more controversial, that I want you to think I'm not greedy. So looking at my action A, you are going to infer something about my marginal valuation for money, which is Vy. And my utility of reputation is going to decrease with the posterior expectation of Vy that you are going to form. Finally, I mean, you might think, I think it's a good assumption for many things. I don't want you to think I'm greedy. Now, if I were a trader, that might be different. And you were my boss, you know, I might want you to think I'm greedy. Not too much. You know, I don't want to bankrupt Bearings or something, but, you know, there are cases where gamma Y might be negative, but I think by and large, people try not to look greedy because in the continuation game, it looks bad. Then it also depends on whether you're going to observe my action, of course. Okay? So it's nice if I help the little old lady cross the street, but if you're not around to see me, it doesn't help me very much in terms of reputation. So let X denote the probability that the behavior is observed by others, or possibly in the case of self-signaling, remember by myself. And it has various interpretations, of course, you know. It might also be word of mouth. It might capture that as well. So let's call mu A the product of X and gamma, and mu Y the product of X and Y. Now, X, mu Y is the product of X and gamma Y. X is also going to be later on a choice variable, so how much publicity you want to give to people's actions. Okay. Now, if you put everything together, basically, the individual is going to choose A so as to maximize the sum of three terms. VA is intrinsic motivation, or VA minus C of A. VYYA is the extrinsic motivation. And then there is a reputational benefits, which is mu A, expectation of VA given AY, minus mu Y, expectation of VY given AY. Okay? And we are going to look for equivalent behavior. Okay? So what I'm going to do now is to give you some heuristic approach to the crowding out effect.
No, I was wondering how, like in the example that you gave, the guy chooses not to get the information, isn't that a signal that he is actually greedy?
Okay, that's a very complex, and thanks for asking the question because the next slide is not coming. Now, actually, it's a very complex issue. Is what is the foundation for self-signaling? Why is that people define themselves with their actions, right? And that goes back to that. And the reason for that, I mean, why do you think, for example, just take the basic experiment. I know you probably would have chosen 5-5. Now, why is that that you would have chosen 5-5? Now, let's assume it's anonymous, so it's pure self-signaling. Now, one of the things is that you want to think of yourself as being a good person, a generous person. But if you knew that you were a generous person, you would not have two signals by choosing 5-5. It's only because you're not quite sure. So you have basically some, and here I'm telling you basically what psychologists say, because for psychologists there is no doubt about what's going on. For economists there is more doubt. But you know, basically the self-perception theory of BEM basically is going to tell you, well, I have some gut feeling about whether I want to be generous or not, but it's kind of odd state, and I won't remember it. I cannot codify, how generous I am, and therefore I won't remember it exactly. And therefore I will look at the action I took in order to know who I am. Okay? I'm going to use at least the action. So that's why people define themselves through their actions. If they knew perfectly who they were, right, they would never define themselves through their actions. It would make no sense. It would be completely redundant. So that's the assumption which is made. Now, the experiments are very complex. They don't have any theoretical explanation at this stage. Because de facto, people are behaving selfishly. They don't want to know the information so as to have this excuse. So somehow it must be the case that later on they don't quite remember exactly what went on. And they have this kind of excuse that actually they may not have heard the other person, right? That's what's going on. But if you think about the exact story, it's pretty complicated, but it also means that we are incredibly sophisticated in the games we are playing with ourselves, right? Because we do that very, very spontaneously. We solve this garbling prime almost automatically. Actually, we have to solve it almost automatically if we want to forget exactly what we did. And it's actually very interesting if you think about it. That's why I love this experiment, because it raises so many questions, and I think it's very nice. There are lots of experiments of this kind. Okay, so let me give you the intuition for the crowding out effect, or the potential crowding out effect. Let's assume you start, here is a space, let's assume your type is VA, your altruism, and VY, which is your greed, extent of greediness. And let's start with a case in which there is no reward. So when you give your blood, you are not paid for that. Then your decision of whether to give your blood doesn't depend on how greedy you are, because you are not paid. It doesn't matter. VY is irrelevant. So basically, you are going to contribute if and only if your VA is greater than some threshold VA star. Okay? That's what I wrote here. So you're going to contribute if and only if you are on the right-hand side here. Right? That's going to be your decision to contribute. The cutoff will be CA, your cost. Here is 0-1. You contribute or you don't contribute to the 0-1 decision. CA is your cost of contributing R of 0 will be notation for how much reputational benefit you get by contributing when the reward is 0. Anyway, the set of people who are going to contribute are the set which were on the right of this vertical line. Okay? Now let's introduce a reward, and let's forget about how reputation changes. Now, standard price theory, I mean, what you learn in your first class of economics, is basically when you introduce a reward, then there are more people who are going to contribute. And actually, the new contributors are the people who are in yellow here. This slope is 1 over y, or minus 1 over y. So you basically won't get many new contributors who have low VY, so they don't really care about the money. It's not going to really change their decision. But people who care a lot about money are going to contribute much more. Okay? That's what's going to happen. So the first effect is a standard price effect. You get the people who are in area B, A and area B, who are going to contribute. Okay, those are, you're going to increase participation. But you have to take into account how reputation changes. And that's a little bit complex, and let me discuss that. Basically, in terms of participation, you are going to get more people who are less prosocial. You're going to get the new people are less prosocial than the old ones. So basically, the honor that you are going to get of participating is going to be smaller, right? You get all those people who are less prosocial than those people. Their VA is lower, so the honor of participating is going to be smaller. However, things are complicated because the shame of not participating is also smaller, is larger, I'm sorry. Because the sample of people who don't participate is going to be biased toward low VAs. So the shame of not participating is going to go up. The glory of participating is going to go down. What about the net effect? That's an effect we're going to discuss later on. For the moment, it's completely ambiguous. Okay? So the glory of participating goes down. The shame of not participating goes up because you get a population with lower VAs. And the net effect is ambiguous a priori. What about the inference about VY? Well, the inference about VY is bad because people will think you participate because you are greedy, right? So that's going to be bad for your reputation. Okay, you're going to people will think you participate because you are greedy, and so it makes sense to assume that the reputation is going to go down. So the net reputational gain of participation is going to be reduced, which is going to move this curve to here. And in the end, the net effect, once you have taken into account this reputation effect, is that you are going to gain type Bs, who are very greedy people, and you are going to lose the people who are in C. Those are people who don't care about the money, and they used to give, but they don't give anymore because the reputational gain has gone down. Okay? Now, depending on whether you have more people in area B or in area C, participation is going to increase or decrease. That's the intuition for what's going on. And I'm going to give you a second intuition, different intuition, in a minute, but is roughly the geometry of the thing. So what we do is basically formalize that in a standard model with normal variables where you can do the updating very easily. So let's take the case now where you have a continuous action A and a quadratic cost function k a squared over 2. Now you can prove many of the results with a general cost function, but it just simplifies things to have a quadratic cost function. Now V, remember V is a vector VA, Vy, and mu is a vector of image constants, mu A, mu Y, remember. And that can vary across individuals too. So in the most general models, the type space will be 4-dimensional. And it's price information, of course. So the distribution is normal. So V, VA, Vy is distributed according to some normal distribution with mean VA bar, Vy bar, and some variance covariance matrix. Okay? Similarly, mu, which is the intensity of image concerns, is going to be normal with mean mu A, mu y bar, and some variance covariance matrix. The only restrictions we impose is that those two subvectors, mu and v, be independent. That's going to allow us to solve the whole thing. Okay. So let's look, and it's a little bit technical, but you'll see the intuitions are very simple. Let's look at the optimal decision of agent. What is the optimal choice A for an agent? Marginal cost equals marginal benefit, right? The marginal cost is C prime of A. When you increase A by 1, you have to pay marginal cost C prime of A. What is the marginal benefit? The marginal benefit is first intrinsic motivation. You are happy because you give more, so that gives you a surplus VA. Then when you give more, you get more money if Y is positive, so you get VYY at the margin. And third, you get this marginal reputational benefit R, which is mu A derivative of the posterior expectation respect to A minus mu y times derivative of the posterior expectation with respect to A. I'm just writing things. I don't know what those are. I'm just writing the formula. So you see you have three terms: intrinsic, extrinsic, reputational. Okay. But the point is that the audience knows only the sum of those three terms. There is signal extraction prime. So I rewrote the formula at the top here. And that's going to give you the intuition behind this signal extraction prime. So let's assume you are trying to figure out how generous I am. So you try to infer my VA, for example. Now, the extrinsic part, VYY, acts as a source of noise. And the important thing is that the source of noise is going to increase. That's a key insight. It's going to increase with Y. When you have a higher reward, then you are going to question more and more whether I did it for the money. And if the reward is 10 cents, probably it's not going to play a big role. But the higher the reward, the more you're going to question whether I did it for the money rather than for an intrinsic motivation. So basically, trying to foster prosocial behavior by increasing Y will tend to crowd out the reputational motivation. The action is going to convey less information about VA. And that's exactly what the psychologists say. That's the formalization of the average justification effect of rewards. Now, there is another effect which is new, which we find very interesting, and I will come back to, which is that when agents also differ in their degrees of image concern mu. So some people care about their image, some others don't. Then the reputational incentive itself is noisy. Okay? So I help the little old lady cross the street. I didn't get any reward for that, Y equals 0, but I get a reputational reward. So you may think I did it because I wanted to buy social prestige from you, or it might be the case that I don't care. But that's going to act as a source of noise. And again, in trying to infer VA, for example, then that's going to increase noise and reduce incentive to invest in A. And there is therefore an over-justification effect of publicity, praise, or blame. Now, the nice thing about normal variable is that you can solve things in closed form. So let's start with a simple example where mu A and mu Y is the same for all. Okay, so we don't differ in our image concerns. And here is the kind of results we get. I mean, it's a special case, actually, but basically they're all the same. That's a special case where VA and VY are not correlated. So if you look at the choice of A by the individual, it's going to depend on VA plus Y VY. Okay. Remember, K is the marginal cost function is K squared over 2. Okay. So that's a standard term. But the interesting term is the reputational incentive. And it's pretty easy to see that this reputational incentive is going to decrease with y in general. So that's basically what, this y square sigma y square is basically the increase in noise that comes up with an increase in y. So the reward y has a standard price effect, which is the term y vy, but is also a negative reputational effect, an increase in the signal-to-noise ratio. Okay. Now, if you want to look at the aggregate supply, it's also very simple because then you take the average. It's linear in Vn, linear in Vy, so you immediately know what the aggregate supply is as a function of y, so you basically get your supply curve. So you can get conditions for crowding out, and I'm not going to do that, but I just want to show you what happens. Okay. So let's assume first that you have no image concern. So what we are going to do is to vary the incentive y and look at the aggregate supply. And let's assume for the moment there is no image concern. Mu a is equal to 0, mu y equals 0. There is no image concern. Then you get, actually it's linear in this case. I mean, you've seen the formula, it's linear. You get an aggregate supply which is just increasing in y. Standard price theory here. Now, when you increase mu a, what happens? So people become more and more concerned about their image. When you increase this, you are going to basically increase supply. Makes sense. People are more concerned about their image. They are trying to buy social prestige, so they are more prosocial. Fine. But when you increase mu a further, then you get to a point in which you have a range, and that's a general result. You have a range over which the supply function is decreasing. Okay? So you do get an interval, exactly an interval of crowding out. And then, of course, when y is large, then everybody will participate. But you end up with this downward sloping thing. Now, the important thing to notice is that the people who are image conscious, they contribute more, but they are also more likely to be subject to the crowding out effect. Okay, they can have this. So if people have a high mu a, they contribute more, and they are more subject to the crowding out effect. Now, application of that is a recent experiment. I mean, you remember Titmus's assertions in 1970 that if you pay people to give their blood, they will give less blood. And of course, the economists and many famous economists argued against that. Now, some people in Sweden recently have run some experiments about that, mainly with students. And it's not going to look too good for the men, I'm afraid. Sorry about that, but women will feel much better after this. So in any case, let's start with the no payment thing. So it's a standard thing. I don't know about Sweden. I think it's a standard thing about Sweden. It's certainly standard in France, is that you're not paid for giving your blood. So that shows so they look at the behavior in the benchmark condition, and basically 30% of the men, less than 30% of the men give their blood, and more than 50% of the women do. Okay? So you can think as possibly women as having, for example, a higher mu-A, so they have a higher concern for thinking they are generous or looking generous. Okay. Now they introduce a price. So they say, now we pay you to give your blood. What do men do? Well, they are just homo economicus, and they just react to the price, and they increase their supply, and nothing new. Okay. Now the women, they reduce their supplies from over 50% to 30%. Lots of crowding out there. So those women who have a high mu-A perhaps basically gave more, but actually, well, it's not clear why they gave less than the men exactly there, but certainly they are very concerned about the reputational inferences from that, and therefore they reduce their supply, they are subject to crowding out. Now, there is a third experiment in which it's very interesting too. And by the way, just think about this experiment. There are lots of theoretical questions that you might ask. I don't have the end of the story with the model. There are some other stories that you have to tell to get, for example, to the comparison between the second and the third experiment. So you tell people, oh, you are being paid, but if you want, you can give the money to charity. Okay? And then the women, the men reduce their supply. you have an extra option. And, okay, you reduce your supply, and the women go back to the normal level, right? Because they have the assumption of giving the money back to charity.
Did the women donate?
Yes, I think so. Yes. Now, here is a puzzling question: is if you are in this second experiment where you get the money, remember it's self-signaling. You are alone in front of a computer. You are the audience yourself. Okay. You get this money. Okay. You could tell yourself, fine, I'm getting this money, but I'm still giving, and then I will give it later on to charity. Right? You could say that. And people don't think this way. Perhaps they think they are not going to give it to charity anyway. If it was social signaling, that's very easy, because if they are watched, they say, I don't want this money, otherwise people won't think I'm generous. So that's different. If it was social signaling, that would be very simple. But here it's self-signaling. So they could tell to themselves, oh, fine, I'm doing it nonetheless, and I'll give the money to charity tomorrow. Okay? So just think about that.
There's a question of commitment there.
Well, there is a question of commitment, that's right. But if you remember tomorrow your pledge, your self-pledge, and you don't do it, basically your personal reputation is at stake. And that we know from other work that personal reputation and personal rules work. So we don't have the complete story. Okay, there's something very interesting there. Another interesting fact is that you get huge crowding out effects if the variance of Vy is large. So if there is a lot of uncertainty, heterogeneity with respect to greediness. And this crowding out effect occurs exactly at 0. Okay? What is so special about 0? Well, in an experiment, it's just the opportunity wage of people. And the story there is that when you move, say, from a 0 reward to a positive reward, or from a negative reward to a positive reward, then the informational content changes completely. If you get a positive reward, then participating is a signal of greediness. If you get a negative reward, then participating is a signal of lack of greediness. So you get a discontinuity there. Or more generally, at your opportunity cost of participating, for example, your hourly wage, you have this sharp downward sloping supply curve. Okay? And then you can, and perhaps I should move ahead a little bit. At what time should I conclude? Just to
about 10 minutes for questions. It's 6:20.
Okay, I'll try. In terms of image rewards, we get rewards not in terms of money, but we'll get rewards in terms of praise and shame and so on. So let's assume now that people also differ in their image concerns. So there are people who are very eager to look good and some others who are less eager. Then the behavior is a noisy measure of true preferences with a noise which is endogenous, right? It's a little bit more complicated, but you can still solve it. The only point I want to make is, again, you have another over-justification effect, because if you see me participate, you wonder whether I'm doing it because I believe in it, or I'm intrinsically motivated, or because I'm trying to show off and buy social prestige, right? And that's going to introduce noise. And actually, if you look at the reputational concern, okay, the gain from reputation from participating, instead of being proportional to x, remember it was proportional to x, once you take this over-justification effect, it's proportional only to x to the 1/3. So it grows not as fast as what you will believe, which it should go as fast as x, okay? The probability that you are being observed, but it grows only as fast as x to the 1/3, actually, you can show. Just a remark on the experiment. It's a field experiment. There's this recent discussion paper by Patricia Funk on vote participation in Switzerland. And it's an interesting experiment because optional male voting was introduced. So basically, you're in a situation where there's a prosocial action, which is voting, and you reduce the cost of this prosocial action by introducing optional male voting. So it's just like giving a reward for voting in a sense. It's the same. So you're basically subsidizing voting in some way. And the interesting evidence is that despite the fact that the cost went down, okay, or the incentive went up, there was no growth in voting. And furthermore, there was even a decline in small communes. Now you might say this is a crowding out effect. You basically make it cheaper to participate and there is less participation. Now, however, it's not a crowding out effect, because once you introduce optional male voting, then you are going to change two parameters in the model. The first is that you're basically increasing the incentive, okay, by reducing the cost, and that's going to increase participation. But then you're also changing x. So you're changing y and x at the same time, if you want. With this single policy, you are changing two parameters. You're also changing x. So if you vote by mail, then you won't be observed by other people. You'll be observed by yourself, but you won't be observed by other people. And therefore, that means that there is less incentive in buying social prestige, or at least if people don't see you voting, they may think that you have voted by mail. And that's going to induce less participation, especially in small commune. In Zurich, probably nobody knows who is voting, but in small commune, everybody knows. Okay, so that's not a crowding effect. It looks like a crowding out effect, but it's not a crowding out effect because you are removing x and y together in this experiment. Okay. So let me just say a few words on social norms and stigma. Something we are very interested in is to try to explain why social norms with respect to prosocial behavior change over time. Okay, so for example, choosing to surrender over death during war. I don't know if it's prosocial or not, but in any case, the norms have changed a lot over time. In the Middle Age, it's not quite the same as now. Not going to church, not voting, divorcing, depending on welfare, minor tax evasion, and so on. We see that there are lots of different social norms depending on the time, also on the country. There are countries, and I don't want to name them, where minor tax evasions is fine, and some other countries where it's not. Okay, so what we have in mind is that there is at stake some endogenous complementarities. If you want to explain those social norms, you might think there are strategic complementarities in participation, for example. Those of you who don't know what strategic complementarities are can think of, if I do it, you have more incentive to do it. That's strategic complementarities. Okay? So what we ask is, when is that if there is more participation, you have more incentive to participate yourself? When do you have strategic complementarities? And you can study that very easily in a simple version of the model where A is equal to 0, 1, okay? And Vy is known, it's equal to 1. But what is not known is Va, the valuation for the cause. And there is some density on this, okay? Now, the important variable is those truncated expectation M plus and M minus. M plus is a conditional expectation of VA, conditional on your participating, so that means that VA is greater than VA star, where VA star is a cutoff. And M minus is a truncated mean conditional on you're not participating, so VA is less than VA star. Okay? And you'll participate if and only if VA is greater than CA minus Y minus R of Y, where R of Y is a benefit from reputation. Okay? The important thing is going to be your net reputational incentive. So delta of V of A, or I should have written V of A star, is your demand for reputation along dimension VA. Remember, your VY is known, so there's no reputation to be gained on the VY front, times the difference between the truncated mean. Okay? Now, if this delta is decreasing, and here I'm being a bit informal, if this delta is increasing, so if M plus those are two increasing functions, right? M plus and M minus are two increasing functions. So if M minus grows faster than M plus, okay, so if the stigma, in a sense, moves faster than the glory, then you are going to get delta prime negative, and that's going to be conducive to strategic complementarity. Okay? So, which means that imagine that participation increases. If participation increases, this VA star, I should have written VA star, this VA star goes down. There are more people who participate. If VA star goes down and delta prime is negative, that means that your reputational incentive goes up. Okay? Shall I go through that again? If participation increases, VA star goes down. There are more people who participate. If M minus grows faster than M plus, then that means that this term goes up. That means your reputational incentive is stronger, and you yourself, you feel like participating more. And that will be true especially if mu is large, so if you have lots of image concern. So what we do then is to study a bunch of factors which is going to give rise to strategic complementarity. And one of them is actually due to a result. One of the results is due to Ian Jewett, which basically links the sign of delta with the fact that the density is increasing or decreasing. So if VA has an increasing density, then delta prime is negative, and then you get strategic complementarities. If the density of VA is decreasing, then there is a typo, delta prime is positive, and then you get strategic supplementability. So more generally, if you have unimodal distributions, you are going to get strategic complementarities in the range of the decreasing densities. So the densities which have high cost and therefore, where the VA star is large, and the VA star, which is a cutoff, is large when the cost is high. And you can think of that as being a heroic axe. Your strategic stability. In this range, okay, where you have increasing densities, then VA star is low, okay, and that's going to arise when you have a low-cost activity, so most of the people participate. And there you get strategic complementarity. Sorry, I made a little bit of a mess with this, but you see what I mean. The key thing is whether you're going to have a decreasing or increasing density. And in general, you will have it's kind of reasonable to assume that you have a unimodal distribution. And in the end, whether you have strategic complementarity and multiple norms or not will depend on whether you have a low-cost activity or high-cost activity, whether you have respectable acts or heroic acts. And that has implication, for example, when you are a social planner and you try to correct for the externality in social behavior, prosocial behavior. So, your second class in economics is to learn about Pigou and externalities. So if there are externalities, and you want to encourage people to internalize those externalities, right? So you give them some money, for example, which are going to compensate them for the externalities they exert on other people. So typically, you will give Y equals to the externality. That's how you get people to internalize the externality. However, here that's not true, because there is something about reputation stealing. Okay, so if I participate, so let's assume I'm a marginal person, I decide to participate. Then I'm going to exert a reputational externality on you, and a negative one, okay? Because either you also participate and then I devalue your contribution because I'm the marginal person. Or you don't participate and then I'm leaving the boat and participating and then you look even worse, okay? And this reputational stealing effect is equal to delta. So basically, when you do PIGU in this model, if you do a model of optimal taxation, basically you have to correct the standard Pigovian externality. And if you combine this with the previous result, then you can show that basically you want to subsidize average activities but not acts that are likely to be, so here it's a function of cost. You're going to subsidize basically average activities but not heroic acts. You're not going to reward them very much. Or acts that people basically, most people do. Okay, so that's going to be the conclusion. When you vary the cost of prosocial action, you can show that for activities which are either very high cost or very low cost, you don't encourage very much, even though the externality is the same, but you are going to basically give a high reward in the middle. Okay. Let me not go through that. Give me 5 more minutes, I apologize. I guess I've already lost any reputation, but I want to mention that because that's very important, and let me go back to something perhaps more intuitive. You know what? You may question everything I've said until now on the following ground. Well, if basically getting a reward is bad because people start wondering whether I'm doing it for the money rather than doing it for the cause, well, there is a very simple solution, is that I turn down the reward. Right? I'm not forced to take it. Okay? Should I do that? Well, obviously not, if I can get secret rewards or givebacks. So if I'm an artist and I go on TV for some charitable organization, then of course I want to claim that I'm not getting any reward for that. I'm not being paid, and then I'm being paid discreetly by the TV. So if there are secret rewards or givebacks, that's not going to work. The other case where it's not going to work is that when there is no uncertainty about VY. Because remember that giving back the reward is really trying to show that one is not greedy. But if there is no uncertainty about VY, so if my VY is known, I'm not going to signal anything by turning down the reward. I'm not going to turn down the reward. But of course, when VY is known, that's also the case where there's no crowding out. More interestingly, there is another case in which I may not turn down the reward, which is image consciousness. So if we are heterogeneous with respect to our image consciousness, then I may not turn down the reward. Why? Because if I turn down the reward, you're going to say I'm trying to buy social esteem, social prestige again, right? I'm showing off. Fine. But then you may think, well, but let me go back to why he contributed in the first place. Maybe he contributed not because his VA is large, but because he was trying to buy social esteem. So by turning down the reward, I actually may be signaling that I'm very image-driven, and then I may be signaling that actually I was doing it for the image concern. So it may not be a good idea for me to turn down the reward either. Something we study as well is disclosure. And there is a question of self-disclosure. Okay. Now, if I do something nice, I want you to know, of course. I really want you to know if I'm being generous or something. But I'm afraid that you'll be learning it only with probability 0.5. Why don't I go and see you and say, hey, I've done that. That's a very nice thing. Look at, I'm so nice. And then x is equal to 1 instead of being 0.5, right? Now, what's your reaction? I come to you, and I say, oh, I've done all those great things for humanity. I'm such a nice person. What will you think, right? Probably, you're Bayesian, you solve for the perfect Bayesian equilibrium. And you think, well, not I'm having concerns about this guy. But precisely, if I tell you all the nice things I did, then you are going to think that I'm very image-driven, okay? But again, same reasoning, if you think I'm very image-driven, you are going to think, well, maybe he didn't do it because he's generous. He was buying social prestige, and he's buying social prestige again by disclosing his very nice acts. So actually, that theory can explain why people don't always brag about the nice things they have done. So let me conclude, and let's forget about all kinds of one of the nice things that you may want to do, and we do it very, very imperfectly, is to try to endogenize the choices of sponsors. But there are very nice things to be done there. So let me summarize very briefly. In this model, there were three basic motives for prosocial behavior: altruistic, material self-interest, social or self-image concern. And the key thing in the analysis is interaction between those three and the response to the informational environment. If you change the incentive X or the incentive Y or the visibility X, you change the meaning attached by observers to prosocial or antisocial behavior, and therefore you change the reputational value of engaging in it. We got results on individual and aggregate contributions, crowding out or crowding in. We discussed briefly complementarity and substitutability in multiple social norms. And there are lots of things about strategic behavior of public and private sponsors. There's also a lot of work for those of you who are interested in the topic, and this is just a small start. Of course, we would like to see if it's important in organization when we organize teams, and whether there is a conflict with high-power incentive schemes inside organization, and what it implies for performance pay. I think it's fair to say that economists, probably including myself, are reluctant to apply stuff on crowding out, which has been demonstrated for children or pupils, to the workplace, and I think there are good reasons for not just transposing that to the workplace always, but sometimes that may happen. We would like to think more about sponsors and their objectives and their behavior. When you think about how they choose X and Y, you would like to know, if you're a museum, for example, director, what's your objective function, and how do you attract money from donors? And clearly, most of those people who are sponsors are not maximizing social welfare exactly. They have their own reputational concerns and so on. Two things we are currently working on. One is the link between law and norms. What kind of prosocial behaviors can be enforced in society by resorting to norms and social pressure, and what can be done through the law and incentives. And finally, we are finishing a paper, hopefully in the next 2 months, a paper on identity, and we are using a more specific version of this kind of idea about self-image and self-perception theory, where people learn about their own preferences from their past behavior, and therefore they behave so as to maintain certain beliefs about who they are. Identity is about self-beliefs, and basically we use that to form a model of identity. And I will stop there. Thank you very much. Oh, an exercise for the students. Yes.
And so, before taking questions, I'd just like to thank Jean once again for coming to present today. He's been very generous throughout the whole process of arranging his schedule around us, and perhaps little did he know I was the only one who saw much of the exchange, and he still was very generous. He arrived just last night, and fought off jet lag and still gave very sound advice to lots of our graduate students and did a very nice job. Thanks to everyone who helped nominate Jean for this year's talk and everyone else who helped plan today's agenda. And thanks most of all to the Rosenthal family. Even though I've never met Bob, his legacy as a great scholar, outstanding mentor, and friend really lives strong in the department, not only to the faculty who've been around for a long time, but to new students and new faculty as well. And we really appreciate it. We're going to ask some questions if you'd like, and then we hope you'll come with us to continue the festivities, have a reception right down the street at the BU Castle. Okay.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Brad.
Sean.
In the U.S., charitable donations are tax deductible. Some charitable donations, like what I give in church, which is a lot, by the way, very observable, and some others say,
I tried to say nice things about me. You could have done the same.
I had to pay more. The other donations to the Red Cross are not very observable. They're typically done by the web or email in, so there's different observability. Now, if there's a tax cut, that's going to basically subsidize this, and there should be some change. Would your model give a definite prediction of what the difference is in the effects on donations that are more public and not when you have a tax cut?
They're all tax deductible.
They're all tax deductible, right. But for those that are observable, there's a different component. So would a tax cut which subsidizes your donations have differential effects on these?
It's a good question. I don't know. So just to make sure, what do you mean by observable? I mean,
that is, when I give money in church, that this is typically very often it's a public pledge.
right.
That I write and say that I'm giving this much money. Everybody in the congregation knows how much.
So it's just like giving to a museum.
Yes, it's something.
It's observable by the audience, right?
It's observed by the audience. Where, as I say, the contributions to the Red Cross are not.
Right. Also, they are not anonymous usually, but
No,
they are
small
less
ones.
observable. So probably a tax cut, basically, I think will have more effect in the case where they are anonymous or less visible, right? That because in the case where everything is very observable by your friends, then people will wonder whether you're doing it because it's cheap or not, and therefore you should have two different elasticities. Now I haven't worked that out, but I think it's a very plausible conjecture. I'm sorry, I hadn't understood the question to start with, but is that your conjecture as well? Or?
No.
No?
You're the one who's getting paid today.
Sorry?
I don't have a conjecture. I just wondered if that was a way that, in fact, you could empirically test some
Yes.
of the...
No, that would be interesting. I hadn't thought about this kind of thing.
Can I ask you about belief? That we use Bayesian updating, that nobody is sort of being misunderstood. Let's say I'm willing to do something for just cost. I don't mind being misunderstood. You can infer that I'm a crazy person, but I don't mind doing it. I don't mind being. Suppose there are two types of these kind of agents around. Some worry about belief more than the other type. Would some of your results be?
But we already allow different image concerns. So there are some people who care about not looking greedy and some others who don't care. So we do allow for heterogeneity in image concerns.
But
Now
it's still straightly Bayesian updating.
It's completely Bayesian in this model. That's right.
I was thinking if you're not so sure about your image,
Yeah.
why maybe
Okay.
you're not so sure about Bayesian updating at all?
About Bayesian updating, that's something that is coming up all the time in a sense when we do self-signaling and things like that, or in our earlier work on memory. In that work on memory, what we do is basically it's work in which people try to be optimistic so as to give themselves energy to do things if they are hyperbolic people. So they try to be a bit optimistic in order to have the energy to do things, undertake things. So they repress, standard psychology, they repress bad news. Okay, so let's assume I repress bad news. And I don't remember anything, nothing comes to my awareness. So should I think that actually it's quite likely they were bad news, but I repress them? So if I'm Bayesian, I should understand that when I don't remember anything, that may be the case that I repressed bad news and they were bad news. Or I might just take it at face value and just assume that there were no bad news. And there are lots of debates in psychology about which one is the relevant one. There are people sophisticated to understand that they repress bad news and therefore they have selective memory, or they are just naive and they just take it at face value. They take their memory at face value. Okay, so what we had to do, because we got lots of different advice on this, and is to introduce a general parameter which basically measures your degree of Bayesianism. And I will say the same thing here for the self-signaling thing, at least, that's very important, how sophisticated you are in understanding how you try to fool yourself into being generous, right? Believing you're generous. I don't know, honestly, and there are big debates among psychologists about exactly. Psychologists believe that people are not exactly Bayesian, and they're probably right. The question is, what shall we do with that, and what kind of departure? The big question is what kind of departure from Bayesianism we should tolerate. If we don't give ourselves some rules, then we completely lack discipline and we lack predictive power. So it's fine to deviate from Bayesianism, but we must have a methodology to do so.
So do you get more social efficiency if you can change, I guess your muse, which are the social norms, and tell people, hey, there's nothing wrong with taking money if you can convince society that it's not unrespectable to take gravy or love money as we probably believe.
I think that's one of the weak aspects of analysis of social norms. And what we do is basically to say, in some cases, basically when you have low-cost activities, you tend to have multiple equilibria and multiple social norms. But we don't say how we choose among those equilibria, which norm is the right. We are not the only one to do it, of course, but we just say, there's this norm in one country and there's this norm in the other country, and whether it comes from fast dependency or whatnot, we don't know. So
you're not thinking about what would happen if a policymaker could influence those norms?
No.
And what the policymaker should do?
No,
is capitalism and greed good? Should we just try to tell people, hey, don't worry about it? If you like,
you might change the incentive, so at some point you get a unique equilibrium. Possibly, we haven't worked on that. But what can you do? You can change the incentives possibly, but otherwise, you can just say, the French president can say, don't evade taxes anymore. They've done that many times. Somehow they don't succeed in changing the social norm. So cheap talk doesn't always work. You have to do something else. But, we can be criticized for that. I think we just built on those two equilibria.
I think we should thank Jean once again and move over to the castle. Thank you, Jean.